Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Here we are, end of January. I can't even believe it. Happy almost February. Welcome back, everybody. So good to see so many familiar faces, and welcome to our audience on YouTube after our taping here live at the end of January. I am Rebecca Berman, proud to be our moderator of tonight's discussion with our esteemed epidemiologist, Glenn Grossman. As many of you know, Glenn Grossman is an epidemiologist with over 20 years of experience. While pursuing his doctorate in epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill, Glenn served as an epidemiologist on staff at the UNC Infectious Disease Clinic for 2 years, and he taught epidemiology and advanced analytics at Duke Medical School and at UNC. He has been involved in epidemiology forecasting and advanced analytics with Bristol Myers Squibb, Sanofi, Novartis, Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Health Administration, Military Health Service, the CDC, and other programs within the United States and abroad. All views expressed today are his own. So I gave you a bit of a preview of where we're going tonight. And Glenn, take it away. You'll maybe start off with how things are looking here in the United States and abroad, and tell us a little bit more about vaccine rollouts.
Thanks, Rebecca. Sure thing. All right, so let me start with that. I'll start with the United States. So things are looking really good relative to where they were a week ago. We're definitely going in the right direction. It's not really good in terms of where we are in terms of the number of deaths. So we're still right in the thick of the epidemic. It's really bad in the absolute sense, but compared to where we were a week ago, the number of cases are dropping very rapidly. The number of hospitalizations are dropping. So this is good news. This is largely due that the death rate takes I think it was like 14 days after the infection is when the infections start to go down, is when we expect that the deaths start to go down. So it's still going to take a little while until we see the death rate start to go down some more. But when you look regionally, you do see that there's some variation. And so this is the cases that we're looking at, if it resolves. All right, so you can see that there was a really sharp drop in the West. California had lockdowns. There were some other restrictions in the South. You see that it's dropping pretty quickly there. The Midwest is going down, and the Northeast also. Across the board, we're seeing drops in some regions more rapidly than others. So this is really good news at a high level. When you look at this chart that I sometimes like to look at, you can see that the week currently ending January 24th, there was not a single state in the country that had a high there. Every state has hit their high at some point over the last couple of months. Some hit them back in November, some hit them more recently at the end of December, early January, but we've gotten over the hump for most of the states at this point. With the exception, we'll talk about the variants in a little while, but the variants have hit the United States. And the variant from the UK is probably 50% or more contagious and spreads 50% more than the common types that are currently spreading around the United States. And so that means that we could have another mini surge in another few weeks, maybe as quick as a month to a couple of months. We'll start seeing another mini peak that starts to come up. But I'll talk about that in a little while. The one other thing I wanted to point out here is hospitalizations. So this is when you look at the big picture of where are people going to the hospital, this is where people are going to the hospital around the United States. We're really getting hit hard in California, Texas, the bigger states, New York, Florida, you see quite a lot. However, when you break this down, per state, so when we look at it this way, then we normalize based on the size of the state. Then you see that some states are actually getting hit a lot harder, even if they're maybe a smaller state, like New Jersey. You can see is being hit much harder now than Florida as a per capita. And Arizona right now is really being slammed again. But like I said, the trends are all going down, so this is good. Let me go to this one. All right, so you can see at a high level, the United States, that we're on our third major surge. The two dips that we're seeing, that you see there, around this point in time and this point in time, were from Thanksgiving and Christmas, New Year's. That it was just a data issue. Um, then United Kingdom, where you've heard about the UK variant. You can see that between back in like September, October, November, we were not too different between United States and United Kingdom. Then they sharply reduced it based on their restrictions that they had there. We never put restrictions in. And so because we never put restrictions in, we kept on going up in our surge. I mean, the data, forget about the data issues with Thanksgiving. But UK was doing a good job of getting it down. But then you can see that UK just shot straight up. And that was because this new variant just started to spread really rapidly. And so then they shut down again. And based on when they shut down again, in fact, I think if you put Ireland in here, Ireland got hit even harder as part of the UK, but they're even more pronounced. See Ireland, how high it got? It's almost like straight up as if they hit a wall in terms of how fast it was spreading, that they had to shut down really fast. And so that and so we know that these variants are in the United States now. And so this is we're likely to see another surge. The other thing I brought up Brazil to look at here. Brazil is interesting because of the variant there. I'll get to that in a little bit. I'll just give you just a taste though. So there was this concept of herd immunity going around. We've talked about it a lot, and now we know that herd immunity does not exist. And the reason that we know, there are some reasons to guess before, but the reason that we know, and we'll talk about it in Brazil, is that over 75% of the population had been infected with COVID-19 earlier this year. They'd been hit really hard. And with the new variant that's out there, it's a new surge, as if there was no surge before. And so that means that the people do not have sufficient effective immune response to attack it. So the antibodies and the rest of the immune response is not sufficient. And so it's demonstrating that the concept of herd immunity, although it was never good, now we know even as a concept, it doesn't exist in the real world for this particular disease. All right, these are just the ones I wanted to talk about here. A couple of other things that I thought would be interesting to look at also. So this estimates the total number of people who have been infected, regardless of whether they were ever diagnosed. Because as we know, the diagnosis rates have been really poor. A lot of people have not been getting tested when they felt ill. There have been a lot of asymptomatic cases. And so there have not been a lot of people who have been tested. This website, this is COVID-19 projections that I've looked at previously. I like some of their results. I like their approach generally. There's strengths and weaknesses with it. They're estimating around 26% of the United States population have already been infected. It varies by state, with some states having a far larger number. I think New Jersey currently is leading in the number of total infected, but we might have been overtaken in the last week or two. And there's a range, so it goes from 17% to 39% in terms of the range, but it's quite large. But what this means is two things. One, even if herd immunity did exist, we're nowhere near getting anywhere near there, and so it's not something that we should even think about as plausible response here. But two, herd immunity doesn't exist, so we should not be hoping for it anymore. All right, let me go to here. So this is the one thing we've talked previously about this. This is the IHME forecast that they do sometimes. And so they've been updating it based on the new variants that have been coming around. The two new variants that they've looked, let me just skip ahead. The two new variants that they've looked at are the UK variant. I'll come back to the variants for a second. Let me just point out the vaccines. So this is the vaccination strategy. Green is what they're assuming based on the current rollout, and blue is if Biden comes in and is able to push the curve up a little bit based on more aggressive vaccinations. And so based on this, we're expecting that we can get over 50% of the people in the United States having their first vaccination by the end of May. And so this is really good news. Either way, the only difference is whether we get them a couple months earlier or whether by May it's more a longer rollout. But either way, by May, we're looking at 50, 60% of the population. By the end of May, early June, 50 to 60% of the population vaccinated, the adult population. But so going back to the variants, so IHME looked at two variants. The two that they looked at were the UK variant, which is interesting because it's much more contagious and much more deadly. But then they also looked at the South African variant. The UK variant, even though it's much more contagious and much more deadly, it's very, very effectively prevented by the vaccine. So people who are vaccinated are protected from it. However, the South African variant, although it's not as contagious as the UK for what it seems so far, it may be, but according to the current data, there's not evidence to suggest it's as contagious yet. And the South Africa variant also doesn't appear to be as fatal as the UK variant. But what's interesting about the South African variant is that it's not as well protected by the vaccines. The vaccines are not as protective for it. And so it does provide some protection. We don't know how much yet, but it's not a huge amount of, it's not the same level of protection for the common SARS-CoV-2 virus that's currently circulating in the United States. All right. So based on the projections of, so including the UK variant and including the South African variant, let me skip to daily. So this is a more interesting picture. This is the daily number of COVID-19 deaths expected until May 1st. And the four scenarios looking were the reference one, where there was the UK variant is expected to go. Oh no, I think purple. Yeah, so blue, so green has some variation due to the vaccine rollout. So it's a sharper decrease than you might have expected previously. But then because of the UK variant, which we expect to start hitting within a month or so I mean, it's already hitting, but within a month, it's going to start building up and really start gaining more speed. Then you sort of see that it had the impact that it has here is we still have a mortality, but it's sort of like just not decreasing as much as you would have expected with the vaccines. And then similarly, the purple is the rapid variant spread. This is if the South African variant becomes more common in the United States. And so then you'd see this additional surge. The worst case scenario, and under the Trump administration, we were consistently going under the worst case scenario month after month. This would see, and the worst case scenario here is based on the assumption that states don't lock down when they need to. There's not enough restrictions. There's too much mobility of people, not enough mask wearing. And in addition to that, then you also see additional spread of the UK variant, the Brazil variant, the South African variant. In that case, we would see another mini surge. My best estimate is we're probably going to hit somewhere around the purple. I don't know exactly, but I would guess somewhere around the purple. We'll see how fast we can get the vaccines rolled out. If we get the vaccines rolled out faster, then it'll push the curve closer to green in terms of what we expect. So the more vaccines we can get out, the further green this is going to be coming. There's additional things we could do right now. So for instance, if there was a universal mask mandate and there were stronger restrictions put into place, in addition to the vaccination that we were doing, you could see how sharply this would fall in terms of the death rate. But so right now we only have a limited mask use. So based on like public transportation, that kind of stuff, but it's not 100%. So it's a limit. That's pretty much all I wanted to discuss here. So I can go on to questions, Rebecca.
Okay, thanks so much, Glenn. Rachel, I'm going to ask you to unmute to ask your question about the variants.
Hi, everyone. So very interesting information. My question is the increase in expected deaths as a result of the variant because it is a more deadly disease, or is it just that it spreads more so more people will get it, leading to potential more deaths?
That is a really good question, and I have the answer.
Of course you do.
Well, I know I don't always have the answer, but I can tell you what the preliminary evidence is suggesting. If I can find it. Where did I put it? Right,
thank you for that great question, Rachel. And while Glenn is looking for the answer, let me know, Glenn, when you have the answer.
I have the answer. But did you want to
Okay.
say something else?
No, I was waiting for you to have the answer. Take it away.
All right, so there's two issues. One issue is how contagious it is, and one issue is how deadly it is. So first of all, we saw a little bit earlier when I showed you the graphs, the sharp spike in UK in infections, not in deaths. Those were infections. So it demonstrates clearly that and also in Ireland, that the virus itself is much more contagious. So that's something different. We estimate it's around 50% to 70 to perhaps as much as 70% more contagious than the current wild types in the United States. However, the question that you're asking is specifically if one person gets COVID with a strain that's in the United States that might be common in the United States, and a neighbor gets COVID and they have the same risk factors, the neighbor gets COVID and they get infected with the UK variant, which one of them is more likely to die? And it turns out, so there have been a bunch of studies that have been done. They're reported here, but the basic gist of it is that the UK variant is around 30% or more likely, more fatal than the regular case. So if you're comparing head to head, one person who has COVID with another person who has COVID, in addition to being it more contagious, just putting the contagion thing aside for a second, it's also more deadly if you get it. So this is bad all around. The one good thing about this is that the vaccines are highly effective against the UK variant. So that's really good. The UK variant is still mutating. All these viruses are still mutating. They don't just stop mutating at some point. I showed you this graph earlier, but before I go to the graph, let me just show you. So the studies here, the main ones, 1.35, the way to interpret this is that it's 30, that this study indicated that it was 35% more fatal than a relative hazard of death than the non-variant of concern. VOC's variant of concern here. This one was 36% more. Case control study was 29% more. This one had a mortality hazard ratio of 90% more. This one said it was around 65% more fatal. But so they're coming in. There is a range. Some of them have a higher, are on the higher end of the spectrum. So 65% more, 90% more. Most of them are coming in around 35%. It is still preliminary, but for the short answer is yes, we do know that they're more deadly. We don't know exactly how much more deadly, but we do expect that they're going to be more severe. And one of the reasons for this is that they seem to increase the viral load. And so there were two basic mechanisms that we tend to look at. One is or three basic mechanisms for these variants. One is if it can replicate faster. And so that would increase the viral load. And so that's one mechanism. And so if there's more virus available, then you just have more rolls of the dice in terms of making it contagious. Another is that not necessarily that you have a higher viral load, but maybe it just tends to replicate more in the nose preferentially versus other places or other airways. And so as a result, or maybe it stimulates symptoms that makes viral shedding or aerosolization more effective. And so that could be another strategy in which it becomes more contagious. And then a third way is if it somehow finds a way to get into the cells faster. That potentially could increase the viral load, not necessarily, but that also could be a way to increase contagion, because you might have a longer period of time where the person is contagious. Anyway, here it looks like the scenario is that it's more viral load that's driving it. Some of the other things could be in play as well, but because there's a bigger viral load, then as the viral load starts going up, then the immune system needs to react much faster. So it makes the immune system drive up to respond to it much faster. And it's the excessive immune response that really is what causes this disease to be so deadly for so many people. All right, I think, was there anything else I wanted to add there? So yeah, I think that that was it for this question. All right, next question.
Okay, terrific. So let's see. Do we want to? So we've talked about the different variants. Let's see. Should we?
Oh, wait, I can talk more about the variants. I didn't do a deeper dive. All I did was UK so far. You want me to talk about the other variants?
Okay, let's do that, please. Thank you.
All right. Oh, sure. All right, so let me jump in here. Where am I looking at variants? Okay, before we talk about variants in particular, I need to remind everyone that the United States is doing an appalling job of even testing for variants, because the only way to know if you have a variant is to do genetic sequencing, to actually look at the genes of the virus. When almost everyone in the United States gets tested for SARS-CoV-2, they're either doing a PCR test just to see if there's RNA that's typical in the virus, or they're looking for the antibody, or they're looking generally. It's like a yes/no question. They're not doing the full sequence. Some countries are doing far better. In fact, the United Kingdom, so Britain, probably one of the only reasons that it found the variant it did. Well, they would have found it eventually just because it was causing this enormous spike. But there are very likely to be other variants around the world that are brewing right now, but they're just not being evaluated. We don't even know that the genes are out there. Like the United States, we already know that there's some variants in the United States that seem like might be more contagious or more deadly. But because we're doing such a poor job of screening, we are probably not capturing them enough. In the United States, we're only screening 0.3% of all the people who test positive for SARS-CoV-2. And so that means that any one sample that you find that might be a concern, say you find someone with this South African variant, that one person represents 333 people in the United States, just based on the small amount of sampling that we're doing. And so let me go in now, just having given you that reference point. So there are basically 4 variants that a lot of us are watching now. There's some others that are emerging, but there's 4 that a lot of people in the epidemiology community are really paying attention to. The first one is called the B.1.1.7 variant. It was first identified in the UK, and that's some people call it the UK variant. We're trying to shift more away from calling it the place, because like I said, really, it was probably just identified as the UK variant because they were the ones who screened it. It might have occurred totally somewhere else in the world, but UK was doing so much genetic screening that they identified it. So B.1.1.7 is the name of that variant. We've talked about that. More contagious, more deadly, but protected by the vaccine. So that's good news. The second thing that's worrisome is South Africa. Okay, and again, the same thing. It was just screened in South Africa. It doesn't mean that it necessarily came directly from South Africa. And this one is called the B.1.351, which is a totally different branch of the virus evolution. This South Africa variant is worrisome because it's more resistant to the vaccines. And so if we find a virus, because right now it's very resistant, but if it mutates even more and becomes even more resistant, then that means the vaccine might be less effective if this starts to spread in the United States, and we'd very quickly have to get a whole nother booster dose for the South African variant. Both Pfizer and Moderna, as well as the other companies that are producing vaccines, are already looking to they're right now testing and trying to create a booster shot for the South Africa variant to see, to get that ready just in case that we need it in the coming months. What's unique about the Brazil variant, this one is called P1. The Brazil variant is interesting because in Brazil, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, this has broken out from the antibodies that people typically had. So in Brazil, and there are some cities where 75% or more of the people there had been infected with SARS-CoV-2. And yet, when this P1 variant emerged, then you had a whole nother surge as if there was no previous infection. Forget about herd immunity. It was as if a whole new virus was just spreading through the land. There's still a lot we don't know about it because it's literally happening right now as we speak. And so we don't know, is it more deadly? How much more contagious is it? How much does being previously infected prevent this, like having the antibodies in your immune system primed? How much of does it prevent the spread? So if, for instance, if Brazil has 75% previously infected, and the United States only has 25% previously infected, if the P1 variant, this Brazil variant, comes to the United States, Will it be even more contagious or more deadly here? We don't know those questions, the answers to those questions yet. The one other that I'm thinking of that's not listed here is in California. There was a new variant that's been identified within the last few weeks, and it's the same thing. We don't have a lot of information on it, but there's some suspicion that this might have been contributing to the large amount of spread in California, the surge that hits California over the last few weeks. We don't know if that's the case, though. It could have been behavior that was driving it, but there is a suspicion that it was the variant that was contributing to it. All right, let me jump in a little bit more here. I've talked enough about these things. The other thing I'll just say about the vaccine. So we know that the vaccines are also that they work here or there. So they work on the UK. They don't work quite as much in South Africa. But also that means that this impacts the monoclonal antibodies. So we've talked about this frequently. We've talked about this before as a treatment. And so it makes the monoclonal antibodies less protective as well. And so those also need to be updated for the new variants. One other thing, and then we'll move on. All right, so here is a map of the United States. So far, there have been 437 of these variants that have been identified around the United States. These are just samples, 437 samples. 434 of them are with the UK variant, 2 are with the South Africa variant, and 1 was with the Brazil variant. So the UK variant is already rapidly spreading, because when we looked at this just a week ago or 2 weeks ago, it was far less. But the thing I want to remind you is that if there's 434 samples that have been identified, then that equates to 144,667 infected people in the United States as the best estimate. So that means this UK variant is already widespread. Over 100,000 people and rapidly growing have the UK variant in the United States. So this is something that we're going to be hearing a lot more about, that within a couple of months or a few months, the UK variant will be the main SARS-CoV-2 spreading in the United States, just because it's going to overtake all the other infections and be much more likely to be the source of infection for most people. Was that it? I talked about Brazil. One other thing, the early evidence of Brazil is that in UK, the UK variant that we're talking about being so contagious, it took 3 months for it to dominate England. Like, so there were all these other variants going around England. When the UK variant, that the name, like the one that we've been talking about, hit England, it overtook all the rest and dominated the landscape within around 3 months. Within Brazil, it only took 1 month for it to dominate the infections there. So the Brazil, you might be hearing about UK and South Africa in the news, but you're going to be hearing about Brazil a lot more, because this, for me, I'm very sensitive to what I'm reading about the Brazil variant. And with that, okay, let's go on to the next question.
Okay. Is there separate testing and tracing when folks are identified with this B117 variant? Thank you for teaching us this way to identify it.
Yeah, that's a good question. There should be. I don't know if that's the case. The problem is, and this is a real big deficiency that's left over from the last administration, we're not doing enough genetic screening of the virus. So right now, the United States is so far behind. We really need to be at least like top 10 in the world doing genetic screening. Maybe I would say even like top 6 or 7. It is going to take a huge investment to get there, but we definitely need to, because the virus is so out of control in the United States. It's the only way for us to find it. The problem is that because one positive test represents 333 different people, there is no easy way that contact tracing is going to solve that, because there's so much spread. It would be too hard to find it. It's not like we're doing just a regular diagnostic test, like people would go and get a PCR test. Even if you were to look at everyone around that one person and see if they test positive, there's going to be 300 other people around who you don't even know where they are. So until we really get our genetic screening up, there's no way we're going to get this under control. So, and it's too late. It's spreading so fast that it's spreading way faster than our ramping up of genetic screening could possibly compete.
All right. Well, we'll just hold on to this information and follow it as close as we can, and hope that we can follow along with some good data and hopefully some good resources to come along behind it. So, okay, so let's jump into a comparison of the vaccines. I think this is a good segue to move into this portion of the conversation.
Sure. So I kind of feel sorry for the AstraZeneca vaccine and Johnson & Johnson. And the reason is when Pfizer and Moderna did their clinical trials for the vaccine, they did their clinical trials over the summer, last summer, and they reported out by November. And the UK variant was hardly spreading anywhere at that time. The South Africa variant didn't have any meaningful spread. The Brazil variant had no meaningful spread. So when Pfizer and Moderna tested their vaccine all across the world, because there weren't these crazy variants, it was highly effective. The genes were much more similar among the people that they had tested in. So it appears very effective. In contrast, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are starting to report some of their preliminary results, and their numbers are lower. The problem is that they have been testing it now under people in England with the UK variant. The vaccine is still effective, but it's a little bit less effective. In the South Africa variant, it's only 50% or less effective. In other places, it's not as effective. It's not potentially as effective. So as a result, their vaccines aren't really hugely comparable to the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines because the clinical trials were done including a lot of the variants that are in existence now. What we know now is that Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines have been tested after the clinical trials were done. They have been tested on the South Africa variant and on other variants, and we found that they're not as effective. So for instance, the Moderna virus this is the B1351 was the South Africa variant that we talked about. It had a 6-fold decrease in neutralizing antibodies. So 6-fold decrease in the antibodies on the on this vaccine. So if Moderna had been slower and were just finishing up their clinical trials now, their efficacy would be probably very similar to what we're seeing with J&J and AstraZeneca. One thing to point out here is that just because it's a 6-fold decrease in neutralizing antibodies doesn't mean that it's a 6-fold decrease in efficacy, because the body, when it's the immune system turns on, has all sorts of things that get triggered: the T cells, the antibodies, etc. And as a result, just because you decrease antibodies doesn't mean you have a proportional decrease in protection. You could still have a similar protection from severe disease, hospitalization, etc. We don't know what those results look like yet. All right. Interestingly, so I was saying here, the Novavax vaccine was 60% effective in HIV negative people in South Africa, but only 50% efficacious in the general population, including people who are HIV positive and HIV negative. So it's interesting that the HIV status, South Africa got hit really hard by HIV. HIV status appears to have an impact on the efficacy of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, which is interesting for a lot of people. Some other things to compare in terms of the effectiveness, I think that they're all pretty effective. Anyone who has access to any of these vaccines should probably not hesitate to get them. The one exception that I'm still personally trying to better understand is the adenovirus vaccines. So Pfizer, Moderna are mRNA vaccines, AstraZeneca and J&J are adenovirus, and Novavax is a recombinant protein. The adenovirus vaccine is curious because in HIV trials a bunch of years ago, they found that the HIV vaccine, they found that the patients who received the HIV vaccine were actually more likely to get HIV than the ones who didn't get the HIV vaccine. Like normally you get a vaccine to prevent getting the disease. They found in that trial that if you got the HIV vaccine, you were actually more likely to get infected with HIV. And the reason that they believe is that it used the adenovirus as the vector to get the HIV glycoproteins into the body. And so as a result, the people develop antibodies not just to the antigens, but also to the adenovirus itself. And so there's a worry that there's something about the adenovirus, the way it stimulates the immune system, that might make people more susceptible to HIV. For most people, this is not a concern, but if there's anyone out there that's at higher risk of HIV, then they might select not to get one of these vaccines with the adenovirus. As far as I can tell, so far in what's been reported, this concern has not been evaluated by either of these companies, but the published results haven't been released, so we don't know. It's all, we've been hearing press releases about stuff, so we haven't been able to look at the actual the actual study itself. When they go for emergency use authorization, we'll know a little bit more, but this is a lingering concern of mine. One other thing to look at, other than age, so Pfizer was for 16 people aged 16 and over, Moderna and the others are all 18 plus. In terms of the number of doses, so they're all 2 doses, except J&J only requires a single dose, and that's going to be very appealing for a lot of people. In terms of the storage, Pfizer has to be kept at this extremely insane cold temperature, or deep freeze. Moderna has to be kept cold, not crazy cold, but I think a regular freezer can do it, is my understanding. But in contrast, AstraZeneca, J&J, and Novavax can be above freezing. They still have to be chilled, so close to maybe a freezer would still be useful, but they can be above freezing and still be okay. And that's pretty much it in terms of where they're about. I think within the next week or two, we'll hear more from some of these as they pursue their emergency use authorization in front of the FDA, and so we'll hear more about this soon. Oh, one other thing, there's some questions about pediatric trials. So pediatric trials have the enrollment's already closed in Pfizer because they've already enrolled enough kids to be able to evaluate how protective it is. For Moderna, the pediatric trials are still ongoing, but their enrollment is still open. And in UK, they're just starting up. The other ones, I haven't seen any reference that they're starting the pediatric trials yet.
So pediatric trials are just happening for kids as only as young as 12. You don't know, they're not testing kids under 12, it looks like.
That's my understanding. I don't know a lot about this, to be honest, in terms of what the study design looks like. I can take a look because they usually publish these before they do the trial. But right now it looks like 12 to 15, 12 to 17. The reality is that kids under 12 are at such low risk of any long-term effects that it's really not something to be worried about for them. And that's why we're sort of doing them last, because for that population, a potential risk from a vaccine might be worse than the potential reward of having it so that they don't get infected. Because at that age, SARS-CoV-2 is so weak. It's like the common cold, if that it's really not that the vaccine might do more harm than good. That's why we're waiting until the end to see them. One other thing that came up, so there was a question just a minute or two before we started. What will this look like in the future? And so when you so right now, people have said, oh well, maybe SARS-CoV-2 will never go away. Well, as it turns out, we talked about this a week or two ago, but let me just talk about it again real quickly. There are actually 4 common human coronaviruses that spread all the time. In fact, all of you who are listening to this have probably been exposed to all of these at some point, probably more than once. Each of these human coronaviruses. They are so common, and they just cause the common cold. They don't cause any big issue. If that, people either are asymptomatic, a lot of people get it are asymptomatic, and some people just get common cold for a day or two. And so they're so common, but we don't even hear about them because they don't cause any symptoms, any severe symptoms. And so they just have these code names like HCOV229E or COV NL63 or HKU1 or OC43. No, only virologists even think about them. What a lot of us expect is that SARS-CoV-2, instead of being a highly pathogenic coronavirus that we've talked about with SARS or MERS or SARS-CoV-2 that we're currently experiencing, a lot of us are expecting that it's going to move over and become a low pathogenic coronavirus. So it's going to be more, if at all, it'll be a common cold. If that, it'll just be something that causes it just asymptomatic. And so it's probably going to look like the reason that it's been so horrific for our population now is because no one had any prior immunity to it. But now we're all getting immunity to it. People who are vaccinated now have immunity. People who are previously infected have immunity. And once you have that initial immunity, and the benefit of the vaccine for people who are naturally infected is we know that the natural infection immunity starts to wane over time. And so the vaccine focuses it to make the antibody response even more potent and potentially last even longer. So that's why everyone should get the vaccine. But once people get vaccinated, then we're going to have this immunity. And even if the immunity, say, only lasts a year or so, then if people get reinfected, presumably most people will just have cold-like symptoms at that point. And so it really is not going to be a scare. Once it gets to the point where there's two different scenarios that I could foresee. One is it gets to the point where all we need is this one vaccine, and then when we just end up getting back reinfected every year or two, but as a result of the vaccine and our pre-existing antibodies, we have very, very minimal symptoms, maybe a cold, maybe something like that. And so it's not going to have high rates of hospitalization or mortality. And so that would be good news. The other alternative is that there's enough mutations, enough variants that come about that we need annual booster shots. And that would be sort of like the flu model that we look at. And so we don't know which way it's going to go yet. It could go either way because we have so many human coronaviruses that cause the common cold that are just in regular circulation. A lot of people think it could go where we don't even need booster shots every year. But it could be more like the flu, where nothing really to be worried about every year, but we do need annual booster shots that we're going to need to get. So that was answered that. All right, Rebecca, next question.
So that's actually, thank you for reminding us, because that's a really great positive outlook of what perhaps hopefully will come in the future. But what about those who have chronic COVID now and they're experiencing symptoms, really unfortunate, kind of the long haulers with the really awful symptoms, the persistent symptoms? Is it really kind of like an autoimmune disease like lupus in a way that just kind of persists? What is that? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so what we know is that when people are first infected with SARS-CoV-2, the acute infection, around 10 days so after a person gets their first symptom, within 10 days, they have an amazing antibody response, and the virus is no longer contagious in that person if they have mild to moderate symptoms. If they have severe symptoms, then within 10 to 20 days, they are no longer contagious. The one exception is people who are immunosuppressed. And we talked a month or two ago that there were some cases of people who had severe immunosuppression, who had asymptomatic disease, and they were contagious for multiple months. And so there is a worry among immunosuppressed people. But if someone is not immunosuppressed, if they have mild to moderate disease, then they're no longer contagious within 10 days. Severe disease no longer contagious in 10 to 20 days. So when we talk about chronic COVID, at that point, it's not replicating disease. They're no longer contagious at that point. But what they have at that point is it's essentially an immune disease, because we know that people who get really severe COVID and people who get chronic COVID who didn't necessarily have severe disease to begin with, but now have the chronic form of the disease, for both of those populations, it really is more of an immunological disease. It's an excessive immune response rather than a virus issue at that point. And so what this study was looking at, which is really interesting, was comparing the level of auto-antibodies. So sort of antibodies that attack their own body. So normally antibodies are supposed to attack viruses and bacteria and foreign agents, but sometimes antibodies attack the person's body themselves, which is really bad. Before the pandemic, it was pretty common to have some auto-antibodies that would be circulating among lots of people. With the acute version of COVID-19, so people who had severe disease that we're looking at here, you can see that there's a lot more auto-antibodies where the immune system is attacking the patient themselves and not just the virus. So you can see that it actually rises with acute. But even more interesting, so this convalescent we're talking here, this is chronic COVID, the way that they define it in the study. And you can see that the chronic COVID cases have an enormous percent, almost 80% auto-antibody prevalence in these patients, which is huge. And remember, chronic COVID, or these patients, they have these symptoms that exist for months after they get infected. What they did is they compared it to lupus. So SLE is systemic lupus. And so you can see that it's actually not so different in terms of the magnitude of the immune response that patients with lupus deal with versus patients with chronic COVID. So it's worrisome in that sense. What's interesting is we do more studies. The great thing about this is it points a way for potential therapies. So for instance, one thing that we're doing is you can look at the specific type of antibodies and the specific types of the immune response. And you can see that in the pre-pandemic people and the acute, like the severe COVID people, you can see that the rates were very similar. The proteinase 3 was the biggest for both. Then came MI2, both the second biggest. JO1, third biggest. The distributions look very, very similar. But then when you get to the SARS-CoV-2 chronic folks, let me bring this to the front. What you see is that it changes. So whereas before beta-2 glycoprotein was much less prevalent than some of these others, now for chronic COVID, it's jumped to the head and is now much, much more important. And proteinase 3, it's still important, but now it's only second. Some of these have switched places. You can see PMSCL 100, and these other ones over here, it was one of the smallest that were identified. Whereas now for people who have chronic COVID, it's jumped to become one of the biggest. And so you can see that it changes the immune response here. So as a result, we are seeing this as potentially an autoimmune disease for chronic COVID. And so right now there aren't any good therapies that have been evaluated that have been given emergency use authorization. I do know that they are being evaluated. And so now this leads the way for even more hypotheses of how to develop better treatments for this new disease. We've all been focusing on SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, but chronic COVID is almost a new disease in itself. It's the chronic form of the disease, which is a very different type of thing than the acute COVID. The acute COVID, the vaccine we would look at for, the vaccine also prevents chronic COVID, but then other types of treatments that we'd be looking at don't have the same impact that you would look at for chronic COVID because this is an immune disease. All right, Rebecca.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for all of that terrific information, Glenn. Really appreciate that comparison. Okay, so lots of questions from the audience about flu. And you've shared over our conversations lots of information about how we've seen such a decrease in flu, not just in the US, but all around the world this year because of mask wearing. Do you expect to see a rebound in the flu next year? And do some scientists believe that the flu season next year could be one of the worst we've ever seen?
Well, not ever seen, because in 1918, the flu of 1918 was the last major global pandemic before SARS-CoV-2, before COVID-19, and so it's not the worst ever. But there is a worry that it could be bad, and here's why. First, let me show you the impact that we've had. So because of physical distancing, what we're looking at here is, so we're at 2021 now. Here, this is 2020. This side of it. This side is 2019. So you can see in 2019, before anything really happened, and this is the United States that we're looking at, you can see that there are all sorts of respiratory viruses that were in circulation. There was not just flu, not just influenza A and influenza B, but also parainfluenza, various human rhinoviruses. The coronavirus is like that caused the common cold they're talking about here, not COVID-19, but the common cold. The adenovirus, other respiratory viruses. And so you can see that they all vary and that there's a huge seasonal impact. So as you start going into when you leave the winter and then you go down into the summer, you can see that the low point is the summer. And then when it goes back up for the winter, starting in September, the kids go back to school and everyone starts spreading it with each other. Then you see that it peaks around the beginning of January or so, and then slowly typically goes down. But then because we had our lockdowns in March, this got rid of almost everything. It dramatically got rid of flu. Flu was the green, so you can see the green almost was virtually eliminated this year. There's a little bit over here, and it got rid of most others. You can see purple was hit really hard, and we got rid of that. Despite our lockdowns, some of these other viruses, they were just the colds. The cold was still spreading a little bit because it's so contagious, the common cold, that some of these causative agents of the common cold were still spreading even despite the lockdowns and despite the severe the mask wearing and social distancing and everything else. However, you can see that when you compare the course of the year, the flu has been minimal. We've still seen the blue, so we've still seen the human rhinovirus. Again, this is just the common cold that's been spreading, but we've had this enormous impact on all of these above the blue. And the thing is that the flu is what really causes most of the morbidity and mortality. So for instance, hospitalizations and deaths. And so there's a couple of worries here. One worry is that typically people, when they get the flu each year, they develop antibodies. And so when they develop the antibodies, then it can protect them in the future. And so as a result, even though it's not 100% protection, there is some thinking that it provides some protection and that might make us better off. The worry is that in the next year flu season, because we didn't have this year's protection, then it might make it worse for us. If a lot of people got vaccinated, and I think I haven't looked at the final numbers, but it seems like more people might have gotten vaccinated for the flu this year than in previous years, then we don't have to worry about that quite as much. When you look at this here, so here's influenza, you can see that influenza is still rising a little bit. We're not physically distancing as much as we need to be now. So you can see that over the last month or two, flu has started to rise a little bit, even though we knocked it down so much. Oh no, this was 2019 rather. So 2020, we have kept it down pretty well. At this point last year, for 2019, you would have expected it to be far higher, but in 2020, it's not. So we are continuing to do a good job for flu. So, but having said that, one worry that we have is that there will be an increased morbidity and fatality. The reason is COVID-19 has impact on the body through specific mechanisms of action. And the mechanisms of action are not the same as the flu per se. And so as a result, the worry is that COVID-19, someone could be sick from COVID-19, but then get the flu and get hit with the flu much harder than they did even with COVID-19, because the two viruses are totally different viruses. And so at the beginning of this epidemic, back in say March or so, some people thought that the ones that would have been most vulnerable for flu would also be the most vulnerable for coronavirus, for COVID-19. And there was a lot of overlap, but the overlap doesn't necessarily need to be 100%. And there is a fear that some people are talking about, which is suggesting that there could be a rebound. So it's rebounds not just to normal levels, but that the flu season might actually be a higher than normal flu season come next fall. All right, that's enough with that one. Let's do one or two more questions.
Yeah. Okay. Let's do that because we're just about at the hour together. So many great questions came in this week, and maybe before we wrap up, I'll give a little bit of a preview of what we'll talk about next week. Looks like we will wrap up this evening talking about should students in K through 12 return to sports. So we will wrap up with that question. We will also talk about, can the Apple Watch or other fitness devices predict SARS-CoV-2 infections? And then maybe next week, Len, you can give us an update on how we're doing with the vaccine rollout, and some more. I'm just looking at some of the other topics that we were planning on discussing tonight. Some really good questions have come in. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more next week about the long-acting monoclonal antibodies. Let's see, you can fill us in a little bit more about what's happening in Israel. They're so far ahead of the game compared to every other country, right,
That's
around the
a good
world.
point. Let me spend 2 minutes on Israel just because I think it's so fascinating for people. Everyone's going to want to see that. Let me jump back up to Israel real quickly.
Okay, so how about tonight we wrap up with what's happening in Israel, and should students in K through 12 return to sports? And then a little bit of a teaser next week. You'll tell us more about, can technology predict infection and everything else? Sound good?
Sounds perfect.
Let's do
Sounds great. All right, I won't spend too much time on this, but just to say, so Israel at this point, around 55% of the Israel population has been vaccinated with at least the first dose at this point, which is incredible. All right, so the question is, okay, so many people have been vaccinated. Has the epidemic stopped, or is it still going on? And so what's interesting is that they found that there was a huge drop off in people who were vaccinated. So people who are not vaccinated were 11 times more likely to be diagnosed with coronavirus than people who were vaccinated. So the vaccination is extremely, extremely effective. It's 92% effective in real world data at preventing the infection. Among people who had the second dose, and it was a week or two after the second dose, then they were 92% effective. And again, just to stress, the vaccine is most effective beginning 2 weeks after the second dose. So don't let your guard down before 2 weeks before your second dose, 2 weeks after your second dose. All right, so 92% effective in general. But then the question is, okay, well, what about severe disease? And so, and this was from the Maccabee Health Service, which tends to have a higher socioeconomic status clientele than the health ministry. The health ministry showed that there was a little bit more infections among them, so it was a little bit less effective in that population. So not quite 92%, maybe in the 80%, 85%, that kind of range, but still very, very effective. But interestingly, when you look at the hospitalizations, already they've seen a 60% drop in hospitalizations for people aged 60 plus 3 weeks after the first shot. So it's already having a dramatic impact and getting even better over time as people get the second dose and their immune systems have more and more time. The immune response for some of these vaccines could take a month or more to really reach its peak. So so don't jump in. Don't get your first vaccine and then say, oh, time to go party. Doesn't work that way. All right, next, let me jump into the other question that we're just talking about.
Okay.
About
K through 12 students in sports.
All right, so there was this, so it's worrisome. What we do know, and it's always good to reiterate, at this point, and I can go back into this next week if people want to talk about it, the question of, wait, where am I? I am up here. All right, the question of whether kids should go back to in-person learning. I think that evidence is almost overwhelming at this point that kids that go back to school are way less likely to be infected with COVID-19 than students who do home learning, and the staff considerably, if they wear the masks and there's physical distancing, the staff and faculty at these K through 12 schools are also much less likely to be exposed than they would in the general population if they were also working remotely. Having said that, the question is, okay, if they do go back to school, what about sports? Should they return to sports? And I can return next week if you want. There's more studies that keep on coming out about schools, so I can return to that in next week if you want. But here's the question about returning to sports. So it depends on the sport, I would say, in terms of how comfortable people should be letting them go back. For instance, if there's some sports like running, where you could have more physical distancing and you could separate, then that is probably safer than an indoor sport like wrestling. Here's an example of a study where I just want to look at wrestling for just a couple of minutes. There was one student there was a tournament on December 4th and 5th in Florida. And the tournament was a 2-day tournament. And one person was found after the tournament to have been infected with SARS-CoV-2. All right. The key thing here is that this one person went on to infect 38 people at the who attended that tournament. Over that 2-day tournament, that one person who was wrestling, just being in the tournament indoors with the other wrestlers, the coaches, the referees, potentially family members, whoever else was there, caused 38 other infections. But then these other 38 infected people, they didn't know they were infected at first. They all went home, and they caused 41 additional infections by infecting their households and the other contacts that they had. So that one person at that one wrestling tournament over 2 days ended up infecting roughly 80 people. And so this is a serious concern. Some sports, it is not really feasible to wear masks during the tournament. So for instance, something like gymnastics, if kids wear masks, it could actually have a risk of strangling them depending on what they're doing and getting in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so as a result, it really is going to depend on the sport. This is when you look at the spread over time from the first person. So the wrestling tournament was over here who was infected. The first person was identified here. You can see the spread that happened over time with all these people, and contacts were still getting identified after from that first exposure, weeks after. So it's going to vary by sport. Like the key thing is that, like I said, kids don't typically spread it if they're prepubescent. The worry is not as much if they're in school, in class learning, but with the after school sports, then it becomes a little trickier. That might be something we don't want to continue as aggressively as we would with in class learning.
Yeah, that sounds like pretty good advice. All right. So I think we should leave it there. Excellent, Glenn. Thank you on behalf of your audience. We are so appreciative of you being our expert neighborhood epidemiologist for all of us, our expert neighborhood epidemiologist. Thank you to everybody who has sent in your questions during the week. That is so helpful because, as you can see, Glenn puts in so much time and research in preparing the slides for our conversation tonight. So as you have questions that come in, you can send them to me, send them directly to Glenn. And we really want to make this conversation for us, about us, by us. So really send those questions. It's really terrific. And of course, as we have the conversation, keep, sending your questions in as we chat. So anyway, everybody be safe. If you're here in the Northeast, good luck with the snow coming our way, and look forward to seeing you same time, same place next Sunday. Everybody have a good week and stay safe. Take care.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.